What's up, everyone? It's Masenko here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about my VDL Season 8 team. I threw together this little PowerPoint slide. I want to give some insight onto some of the mons that I picked, some of the ideas and themes behind the team. I'll give a little rundown of sort of my schedule and how some of those matches turned out, and hopefully I can impart some of the lessons that I learned, of which there were many throughout this season, and provide a little bit of insight to you as the viewer. So if you enjoy this type of content, please leave a like, and let's get into it. So as you'll see, this is an overview of the team by the end of the season. I didn't initially draft Gorgeist, Barraskewda, or Ditto. I made those trades during the season. Originally I had Virizion, Swampert, and Poltegeist, respectively. But the idea behind this sort of team was that, previous seasons of VDL, I had some more gimmicky strats. Like, for example, I had a little Trick Room team, and then last season I had sort of a weird Perish Trap team that didn't ultimately work out so well. But I figured, this is going to be probably my last draft experience for Sword and Shield. So I wanted to, just take it seriously, try to get as much value as I could out of each tier that I was picking from. Just pick overall solid mons who were flexible, and I could do some interesting draft situations with, and I think I was honestly fairly successful at that. So my first pick that I had gotten when it came to me was Tapu Koko. The next one after that was Celesteela, and this was a bit odd because, first and foremost, I was pretty far into the draft. I think I was like maybe 20th or 21st out of 24, and Tapu Koko had not been picked yet. So I was really happy to grab it. It was a mon that I was really interested in trying out. And I also really wanted to try out Celesteela as well. And the fact that it got back to me and I got that as my second pick was part of the reason. I don't know if traditionally I would have picked so top heavy. I mean, these were both tier 1s, already, dipping into my free picks pool with that Celesteela pick. But I mean, they were both mons that I really, really wanted to try. I felt like they had some pretty decent synergy, despite a little bit of anti-synergy with Celesteela getting a little bit hurt by the fact that other mons could benefit from Tapu Koko's electric terrain against it. But regardless, I felt like, you have a steel type that is immune to ground, whereas Tapu Koko is obviously weak to ground. Tapu Koko's other weakness being poison. Celesteela is also immune to that. So, and obviously, Tapu Koko resists the electric that Celesteela is to as well. So, all of that together, it felt like they had some pretty good synergy that I am rounding out my fantasy core with. I also picked up Flygon, who I think is a really high-value tier 4 pick, who had some pretty wonderful synergy with the Tapu Koko and the Celesteela already to finish off that fantasy core. It obviously has Levitate, making it immune to ground as well, synergizing with that Tapu Koko, covering for that weakness. Of course, it has, 4 times ice weakness, but is relatively fast. And I liked the kind of idea of having Celesteela as sort of an anchor mon, something that can just kind of sit on the field, start, getting beast boosts, potentially, getting some special attack boosts from Meteor Beam or, whatever else I could be doing with it. While Tapu Koko and Flygon, I perceive them as pretty solid pivot mons, right? Obviously, Tapu Koko wants to be able to switch out eventually to reset electric terrain for itself. It gets Volt Switch, and it's somewhat frail. It's not the most frail mon in the world, but it does not want to just sit there and tank everything. So you can really take advantage of its speed, and it can be a big threat in that sense. And Flygon's somewhat the same. You have first impression on it potentially. You have U-turn. So that Fantasy Core was pretty important. I wanted to at some point pick up Thievel as another tier 4, who I think has not only pretty good for a tier 4 just generally speaking, but with Tapu Koko on my team and having that unburdened synergy, it would have been an incredibly valuable tier 4. However, it did get picked before I was able to snag it, so I ended up going instead with Lipard, who ultimately ended up being a really fantastic pick as well. Obviously, a lot more expensive as a tier 2, but still has Unburden, and it also has access to Prankster. And again, it's playing in sort of that sort of pivot style that I enjoyed. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the ideas that I had for that Lipard once we get to it. The other thing that I wanted to take advantage of with Electric Terrain was Electric Seed, right? There are some Mons on this team who definitely benefited from it. Double in particular was one that I had already sort of tried that synergy out a little bit. My good friend Matrix will have nightmares about the Electric Seed Beware with Electric Terrain Rotom setting it up for it with that fluffy ability. I think Beware was able to survive a Guts boosted close combat from a Heracross and an Electric Terrain boosted, Life Orb, Bolt Beak from an Arctozolt. So I mean, and live with like a pretty decent amount of health left. I think it was about 10 to 15% left, but just that +1 from Fluffy obviously showed how powerful of a defensive option that was. And Double actually has a higher defense stat than the Beware, as well as a similar, I believe, HP stat. So I felt like as a tier 5, I could make a lot of use of the Double potentially. Obviously it's not on the sheet here, but Poltergeist, I had sort of a similar idea that this is a Mon with like some pretty low defense, but having access to basically free electric seeds was something that I could make use of. Same with Virizion, also not on this sheet, but I also, and one thing that I wanted to do with the Virizion in particular was it kind of fit within the speed tier that I was going for. I think it has 108 speed. But I wanted to start rounding out my Fire, Water, Grass core, and a pairing that I really wanted to try at some point was the Virizion Salazzle. Not only are both incredibly fast, but they have the beat-up synergy potentially, as well as just having like good overall utility and complementing each other, one being quite good at physical offense, the other being special offense. They cover each other's weaknesses quite well, with both of them only being weak to Psychic as their shared weakness. So that was something that I wanted to try out. Ultimately didn't work, and we'll talk about why. But yeah, so and again, Salazzle kind of worked out as well into this pivot strategy that I was kind of starting to think about, which one of the classic draft move sets for Salazzle, or one of the classic sets for Salazzle, is this Oblivious plus Eject Pack Overheat set. Potentially you have Fake Out on it, so you're going to want to reset that and pivot out the Mon as much as you can. So that was all good. And then I was actually really torn already from the start between picking Swampert and Barraskewda. The Swampert was another ground type like the Flygon, but I felt it was pretty useful to have, especially if I was going to have like a secondary water type on the team, like a Walrein. I wanted one that would be able to not have to worry about the electric terrain that I was setting. So Swampert would, obviously uh, benefiting from its ground typing in that sense. But I also was sort of inspired by how Goomer had used it on his previous team back in, I believe, season 6, where he also kind of used it as sort of this kind of cool pivot mon. It had like moves like flip turn and had some decent utility options with it. I'll go into a little bit why it didn't really work out for my team, and generally speaking, I think I probably should have just picked Barraskewda from the start. But I that was sort of the idea behind it. The Orbeetle on the team as well is a mon that ultimately was there as mostly a very high value tier 4 pick. It's got incredible defensive stats. It has a lot of utility, and I needed some form of speed control in this team, and I felt like the ability to shut down Trick Room with Imprison on an Orbeetle was fairly reliable compared to a lot of other sort of more frail mons that had to run that. So that was sort of a form of speed control, and then of course I had moves like Electroweb on the Tapu Koko and other interesting stuff like Bulldoze, potentially Icy Wind on a couple mons, I believe. So and I had Prankster obviously as well, which was a pretty decent speed control option. So although I didn't have like any specific modes initially, like Tailwind or Trick Room, I did have sort of I did feel like I wanted to cover some of those bases, and that was sort of the team, right? I mean, we're gonna get into specific mons and go into a little bit more detail on my thoughts on them individually, but really it was just pick good stuff, sort of try to synergize if you can with the electric terrain, with the speed tier that we're working with. Try to cover your bases in terms of having good, flexible offensive options, defensive options, speed control options, and sort of play to some themes, right? And the themes being having a decent Anchormon and having some decent pivot mons to play around them, and really try to dictate the pace of the game using that strategy. Now let's touch a little bit on my record. So I mean, as you'll see, I didn't perform too well on paper, but surprisingly, I do think that this was probably one of my best, if not my best, season in terms of my own performance. I felt pretty proud of how I prepped and played. I felt pretty proud of the team that I drafted, and I think part of the record can be explained through some slight errors throughout some of the games, but mostly if you just look at this schedule, it is kind of ridiculous. Like it's an incredibly difficult schedule. Weeks 3 through 5 were against all VDL V champions of the past. Week 7 was against the ELS champion of last season. I was against Gumi and Lucian, both of whom are incredibly well respected and top tier players, despite perhaps Gumi having a less than optimal season. Still is an excellent player, so didn't feel like I wanted to underestimate him for those reasons. And then obviously Miss Mag and Batista, both of which are incredibly close to me in terms of prep that we do together. But also, if you look at their records, they actually made it really, really far. Batista had made it to the top 8, and Miss Mag had made it to top 4, I believe. So overall, like the strength of schedule here, I think is unparalleled, frankly, in terms of who got through to playoffs and just based on prior seasons, the strength of these players. So the fact that I walked away with mostly 1-2 losses against these players, except against Otto and Goomer, weeks 4 and 5, made me feel quite proud. And I think if you ask most of these players, they will probably tell you that they felt like I played and prepped pretty well against them. So, it's just a matter of opinion, but so just to, break down just very briefly each of these matches, maybe a couple takeaways from them. I think the main thing I was learning during week one, as everyone should be learning week one, is kind of how to pilot the team, how to prep with the team. I'm pretty happy with how I did. Just, most of my game ones throughout previous seasons of pretty much every draft league that I do tends to be I tend to have a bit of growing pains, but felt like I adapted pretty quickly to some of the interesting stuff that my team could do. Week two, I felt one of the main takeaways was, it was just kind of some interesting RNG on both sides. I think if I had landed something game two, it would have been a 2-0. If he had landed something game three, it would have been a 1-2 to his favor. So, just name of the game. I think we both prepped well and played well. It was just sort of a slugfest with a lot of aggression. Week three, I learned a lot about sort of on reflection how I should be changing up my leads. I think game three, if I had just led the dub wool and trusted my gut that he would be switching up to his sand mode, that I could definitely take advantage of that with the fluffy strategy that I had talked about before. And I think it was one of those situations where I was able to accurately predict what he was going to do. It's just I wasn't really confident in myself and making those hard calls and going for more like safer, more generalist strategies rather than trying to adapt more specifically to what I thought he was going to do. Week four, I got a little bit unlucky in game one with a crit that was pretty devastating, but I also made a couple sort of misplays. I think when I was up against a player like Otto, I had previously played Panda the previous week, and I was going into a game with Goomer next week. All these are very, very intimidating players, and so just being able to get that experience against what it's like to play against the highest level was I felt like really useful to me. I felt like there were some hard reads that I made in the week against Otto where if I had just I think this is the second time I've done this where I clicked air slash, I believe, into his Thunderous instead of Flash Cannon with my Celesteela. If I had just clicked Flash Cannon, wouldn't have missed. It would have had a higher base power anyway, and it would have picked up the KO, and I would have been in pretty good position game two if I had just done that. So a bit of a blunder there, but overall, like, felt like my positioning and reads were pretty decent. The week 5 matchup, I actually don't remember it too well. I think I had predicted that Goomer was going to make a switch in game 2, and so I went for the safer sort of generalist. I think I was running special Flygon, went for an Earth Power instead of a Giga Drain into his really low health Hippowdon, expecting that he might bring in Galarian Weezing. And it was ultimately the wrong call because the Earth Power left the Hippowdon with 1 health remaining. And it was a roll. I think I was favored with that roll, but so a little bit of bad RNG there. I think I could have definitely brought that to game 3 with a little bit better RNG. And I actually think that, I still made the right choice there, because if he had switched in that Weezing, it would have been pretty bad for me to have gone for the Giga Drain. I think I would pretty rough position potentially with the Dracovish next to the Galarian Weezing there. So I think that was just sort of a bit of unlucky game. I think game 1 I didn't position quite well, and Goomer is incredibly good at this sort of attrition game where they can outpace your positioning a little bit. With their positioning is incredible. I think as a player, Goomer is just is a masterclass of positioning. So if anybody goes and watches his final or his previous matches from these playoffs, just go watch how he positions his mons. It's incredible, and very, very wonderful player to watch. I think week 6, I played an incredibly good game against Gumi, and I think he played one of his better games against me for the season as well. There was a point where I really needed to sacrifice my Gourgeist so that I could reposition my Barraskewda safely. Believe in game 2, potentially, if I'm not mistaken. It might have been game 3. Having trouble remembering since it was several weeks ago. But I think the main lesson, the main takeaway there was learn when to, especially when you're playing sort of a pivot, maybe more aggressive team that I'm not always used to playing. I'm more used to playing more defensive mons. When to take advantage of sacrificing a mon to regain that momentum, take advantage of that pendulum swing. I was maybe thinking too hard. I wanted to preserve this Gourgeist in a position against a Moltres and I believe a Berserker, where just genuinely it would have not done much in that. And Gumi took as he should have. He played to his out. He took a really risky Hurricane into one slot, and he went for a Gunk Shot into my Tapu Koko, and those ended up picking up the KOs, and it ended up working out for him. So if I had just sacked there, I think I would have been in a much better position in that end game. Week 7, which I actually played after my week 8 match, I took advantage of a lot of what I learned. My game 1 was pretty abysmal. I was just trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. It was sort of a Disquake strategy that I had not really prepped for too much, but then I sort of switched up the lead, did some Trick Room shenanigans with the Gourgeist, and ultimately was able to make good reads and played decently well despite some small blunders with the Ditto. And then in week 8, against Lucian, he brought a pretty unconventional set against me. And if I had just brought Sheer Cold on the Walrein, it would have actually probably fared a lot better for me. But I ended up taking game 1 to Timer with a Rest Walrein set, and he, I switched it up game 2. I wanted to go a little bit more aggressive, see what kind of stuff how he would switch up against that sort of more passive play style with the Rest Walrein set. And he ultimately won that. And then game 3, he had some really, really excellent positioning, making a lot of really good switches and calls into what I was going to be doing. And then ultimately, there was sort of a funny moment where the Rest Walrein really needed to land a hit onto the Magneton, and not only did the Sleep Talk, click a attacking move, it didn't hit the rest. It also targeted the Magneton slot, but it was a Hydro Pump, and it ended up missing, and then he won off that. But ultimately, I felt pretty good about my prep during that set as well, and felt like I navigated the games well as well. So overall, that was how my season went. I felt like genuinely, if I had made maybe 1 or 2 more better decisions, maybe if I'd been a little bit luckier in a couple situations, that I definitely could have ended with a much better record, right? I felt like I was actually mere inches away from a potential 4-4 record or even a 5-3 record, if I'm being a little bit optimistic. So now we're going to go through the individual mons and talk about how each of them sort of functioned for the team or didn't. I did rank them in terms of sort of their usefulness to me, in my opinion, but do know that these rankings aren't generalized, right? They're not saying that this mon is worse than this other mon. It's just in the context of the team that I had crafted, I sort of ranked them in terms of how useful I felt that they were for me. But certainly there are mons who are lower on this sort of ranking that I feel could certainly do well on a different team. And I also feel like they're all good mons, period. I mean, I really didn't pick any sort of like throwaway mons for this draft. I really focused on picking high quality mons for each tier. Yeah, again, just keep in mind that this is very much for the context of my team, and we're going to talk about why a mon worked or didn't work, and maybe it could give you some insight as to why it could have worked or didn't work for your team. If you have ever tried those mons or wanted to think about picking them. So let's start out with number 14 is Poltegeist. So this is a mon that I actually never brought, and it was the only mon the entire season that I did not field once. I had it for 3 weeks on my team. I ended up trading for Ditto, and I think part of the issue with the Poltegeist was, well, there were several issues, right? But let's first, I guess, talk a little bit about why did I pick Poltegeist to begin with. And the first consideration that I had was this idea of Electric Seed Poltegeist. If you look at Poltegeist stats, it is a mon with a lot of special attack. I believe it's 130 something, maybe 34 if I'm not mistaken. It has pretty good special defense as well, but it has pretty abysmal defense, right? And the fact that I had electric terrain, right, meant that I could give it an electric seed, boost its defense, and really take advantage of that sort of synergy. I could account for that sort of weakness that Poltegeist had. The main issue that I sort of ran into with the Poltegeist was that it mainly just didn't really fit the speed tier that I was going for. I didn't have any redirection for it to, set up a Shell Smash. If I wanted to run it with like a weak armor set with potentially like weakness policy, I did have Brutal Swing on like Celesteela. I did have like Beat Up on Salazzle. I did have like Sucker Punch on, I believe the Lipard was, I think, my only one with the Sucker Punch. But all of that was like actually doing like way too much damage for my own liking. Considering, obviously Poltegeist, has that low defensive stat that I was talking about. Not to mention, the weak armor, while it does increase your speed, it's going to lower that defense even more. And the main issue there becomes the fact that Poltegeist really just becomes this sort of glass cannon. It does a lot of damage. You could do a stored power with weak armor, weakness policy. That's a lot of stats. You can really nuke something. But any priority move is just gonna completely nuke it at that point. Most of the priority moves being physical. So at the end of the day, like I felt like maybe it just wasn't really my play style. Like I'm not a very aggro player, and I felt like if you really wanted to make use of the Poltegeist, you would have to be aggro. But I also just felt like even in the matchups that it was decent. I had just like better, safer options to bring. If I wanted grass coverage, this was a pretty good grass special attacker potentially. It has like, I believe, Giga Drain. I had Celesteela, right? Celesteela gets grass coverage. Tapu Koko gets grass knot. There was some just like better special attacking grass options. One mon that I actually brought a lot as special, as you'll see down the line, is the Flygon, who also gets Giga Drain. So like, it's faster, or I just had mons that were faster or bulkier on the team doing what I felt like Poltegeist was fulfilling. The other option, aside from this sort of glass cannon set, was you could run it with Cursed Body instead of weak armor, and the Electric Seed, and you can run it with Strength Sap. You can run it with Will-O-Wisp. But again, I felt like those moves and that sort of a style was a bit too slow for the speed tier that it was at, as well as the fact that I could just run Electric Seed Lipard instead, who similarly not as defensive, but much faster with that unburdened proc, and you get access to moves like Charm anyway, which in some obviously situations, against like clear body mons and whatnot, Will-O-Wisp is better, I guess, but I wasn't really running into that as much as it to become sort of an issue. So Poltergeist ended up just not being necessary for the team, and I ended up getting a lot more value out of the Ditto, which I felt was a better fit strategically for the team that we'll talk about in a little bit. Next up is Virizion. I kept Virizion on my team for 5 weeks before I ended up trading it for Gorgeist alongside trading Swampert for Barraskewda. I brought it to 2 matches out of those 5 weeks. I believe they were weeks 1 and 2. And I believe week 1, I ran it with a White Herb into the Incineroar that Miss Mag had, with close combat, obviously. And then I think I had, I believe, Brick Break for... No, you know what? I think I brought Brick Break week 2 because Miss Mag didn't have Klefki yet. Yeah, so I think I had, just sort of a decent White Herb set that could take advantage of the fact that it could beat up Incineroar a little bit. Some ideas for consideration for the Virizion that I had were, obviously I mentioned the beat up strategy, which I really couldn't find a reason to bring most of the time. It was just maybe a little bit too risky. Again, like, I think one of the main issues that Virizion has, in my opinion, is its move set. Its coverage is really kind of bad, in my opinion. It has really good fighting moves and grass moves overall, but outside of those stab coverage moves, I was running moves like, as you can see here, Smart Strike and Stone Edge, which in my opinion are really not ideal coverage moves, right? You'd rather have moves like Iron Head, you'd rather have like Rock Slide, which I believe the other Swords of Justice get. At least, Terrakion gets it. But so, I was forced to run, some pretty suboptimal coverage moves, as well as, the fact that even with an Intimidate, I was being forced to run like White Herb potentially. I ran the Choice Scarf against Batista, his Mono Ice team. That was basically there to pick up KOs with, Choice Scarf Virizion with like close combat, right? It's a Mono Ice team. You want to be able to one-shot the Darm, potentially one-shot the Weavile. So that's really what I used it for. Then, the other sort of consideration that I had was the coaching sort of quick guard, potentially more supportive Virizion sets that were possible, or maybe even bring it as a special attacker. It has Leaf Storm and other pretty decent, it has Air Slash as a coverage move as a special attacker. But again, never really felt comfortable bringing it too much because of that 4 times weakness that it had, because of that sort of physical weaknesses that it had. It's another mon, again, that benefits from Electric Seed in that sense, but it just kind of had too many flaws. It was maybe a little bit too niche, and didn't feel super comfortable bringing it most of the time. So those were sort of my takeaways from Virizion, but I do imagine there are some players out there who could definitely wield it better than me. And I feel like that's true as well. Both been proved for this next pick, which is my other trade, which was Swampert. Again, brought it only 2 out of the 5 weeks that I had it. I think I brought it against specifically Miss Mag and Otto. Otto had a Blaziken. I think Swampert, ended up matching up pretty well into it. But I didn't really feel super comfortable in bringing that Swampert because of the potential grass coverage that he was running. But that was there. It's just at the end of the day, it was again just kind of like the Poltergeist, not in the speed tier that I was wanting to play at. Did not have that natural speed that, say, a Barraskewda has. And despite having sort of like type synergy with the sort of electric terrain that I had mentioned before, it was just kind of a little bit too slow. It was kind of a little bit unsafe depending on what their lead was. If I had led something like a Swampert and they had the grass coverage, it would often put me in somewhat of an awkward position. As you see there, I did bring it with some interesting stuff. Specifically, I'm looking at the mirror coat there. I think that counter and mirror coat are really interesting moves on Swampert, because it is pretty threatening mon overall, and your opponent will want to be targeting it with, grass coverage. So if you can kind of predict when they're going to do that, counter and mirror coat can be easy, pickups with, like, if you're running a Rindo Berry on it. You also get a lot of really nice support moves like Yawn and Wide Guard. It does have some pretty decent specially offensive coverage moves. There was a point where I was considering running it with, Sludge Wave or, Surf or Muddy Water, stuff like that. Some pretty decent, like, spread special attacking moves that could be pretty useful. But, at the end of the day, it just, was a little bit too slow for my team, a little bit too risky to run reliably, and as somebody who enjoys having a little bit of more control over the leads that I have, and feeling a little bit safe, wanting to feel safe, doing some switch ins, it felt like Swampert wasn't exactly ideal for that play style, and that's why I ended up swapping it. Number 11, unfortunately, was the Dubwool. So Dubwool I did keep for throughout all 8 weeks. I did bring it twice, and as you'll see, I brought it with basically the same sets both week. I brought it with Electric Seed and Fluffy, Body Press, Cotton Guard, and then some utility options here and there. Wild Charge is a really nice coverage move, especially if you're playing on electric terrain. Zen Headbutt is okay, right? It's psychic coverage. I think the other coverage option he has is Payback. Baton Pass was, sort of an interesting pivot option that I was potentially going to run. I think I ran double against specifically Panda, and I'm actually struggling to remember. I think it might have been Goomer that I played double into as well. But regardless, it was effective in the matches that I did bring it overall. But one of the main reasons I think Double suffers and is sort of a tier 5 mon, despite its pretty decent stat line and pretty straightforward strategy, is that it really only does have that one strategy, right? Like the Cotton Guard body press stuff. It really doesn't have a lot more going for it. Obviously, it does get like Swords Dance, which, again, sort of the same concept, obviously, right? Because, whether you're going Cotton Guard body press or Swords Dance in a more physical oriented set that isn't using body press, it's not doing well. And another thing is that, like, against ghost types, your only real coverage move into it is Payback. So like, just overall, its move set is just not really conducive to more strategies. The one thing that, like, you could have potentially done on the double was like a rest sleep talk set potentially, which is something I ended up doing later in the season with Walrein. But then you don't really get to run it with Electric Seed, right? Because if you're setting up that electric terrain, you're actually not able to run rest. So just a bit of anti-synergy there, and a bit difficult to run. If it's the type of mon that if the opponent doesn't really have an answer for it, then it's good. But if the opponent does, if the opponent, can just kind of play around your little setup, or has like a ghost type, it's generally not gonna do too well. So that's I was happy with the double. I think it worked well for the team, but I also think that double is probably one of the weaker mons that I ended up picking, just in terms of its move set. Wish it had more coverage. Number 10, unfortunately, is the Orbeetle. The Orbeetle is a great mon. Let me just say that outright. It has a lot of utility, has a lot of different things, great bulk, great optionality. You could run an Iron Defense body press with like Recover. You could run it more supportive. You could run it, as a trick room setter or denier. There's so much you can do with it. The main issue that I had with the Orbeetle was that it actually shared too many weaknesses with some of the mons that would hypothetically replace it, right? I talked about this sort of anchor strategy, and Orbeetle is another sort of anchor mon, right? It can sit on the field and be a threat, start calm minding, start iron defensing, or provide a lot of utility and disruption, spamming struggle bug or whatever else it wants to do on the field and just be a bit of a menace. The main issue was who are the other mons on my team who want to do this? Well, Celesteela, right? Both of these are weak to fire, and Celesteela does not actually resist rock, right? Walrein as well, weak to rock. So it's pretty effective, especially like in practice. A lot of times, spamming heat waves, spamming rock slide, ended up being like just sort of annoying for the Orbeetle and made it a little bit difficult to bring. But as you can see, just from the 3 weeks that I did bring it, it was incredibly, diverse in terms of what I did with it. So one week I did bring it with Electric Seed, which obviously helps bolster the body press set with. I actually didn't run Iron Defense because I was able to run Electric Seed, which was pretty nice. Aguav Berry and Key Berry. Aguav obviously just for a little bit of health, and Key Berry for as well just some defensive bonuses, which could have been. I don't remember whether that was with the body press set or not, or whether that was the Electric Seed, but either way, just nice to get some defensive bonuses. And I was probably running Electric Seed on a different mon that whatever it's called, that match, right? As you'll see, I ran it with 2 out of those 3 weeks that I brought it. I ran it with Imprison, Trick Room, and Struggle Bug. Those are just really decent support moves, right? Like I just wanted to imprison the Trick Room. Another thing that was kind of interesting that I ran, I believe, against Panda's Primarina was I was a little bit worried about Energy Ball into Swampert. I think maybe Swampert was what I brought into Panda as well as Auto. Maybe it wasn't Goomer that I brought Swampert into, but I had a sort of an idea of imprisoning the Energy Ball away from Primarina to allow Swampert to have a little bit more room to function. I also, I think, brought Imprison into. I might have brought it into. I believe Miss Mag's Cofagrigus. Imprisoning Trick Room as well as Body Press as well as Shadow Ball. Like that's a lot of moves that Cofagrigus likes to run. So ultimately I could have been incredibly disruptive with that. I don't know if I ended up using it in that way or fielding it at all, but there was just a lot of little cool things that Orbeetle could have been doing. Some other considerations that I had for it, obviously I ran it Frisk 3 times, but Telepathy was definitely an option for me. I also had Telepathy on Tapu Koko, and I had a lot of mons with like decent spread moves. I had already mentioned Swampert had some pretty interesting stuff like Sludge Wave and Surf, but obviously Celesteela also gets Earthquake. The Flygon also gets Earthquake. That's its main physical stab that it gets for ground coverage. So Telepathy was definitely a consideration. Another one was running Psychic Terrain. If I had Electric and Psychic Terrain, I could do some interesting stuff with even like a Psychic Seed. Hypnosis was an option as well. I had Salazzle on the team with Sweet Scent, so I could have done maybe some Sweet Scent Hypnosis stuff, but ultimately that never really that opportunity never really came up, nor was it particularly reliable. So overall, I think Orbeetle is still an insanely great value mon. Has a lot of things going for it. the main issue with this team mostly was the fact that most people would be bringing coverage options into some of my more sort of bulky threats that already sort of dealt with the orbital pretty effectively. So ultimately felt like maybe it was the wrong sort of pick for this team potentially, but in the games that it did come, ultimately did provide a decent amount of utility that I felt was worth it. So pretty good mon, but ultimately was a little underwhelming for what I was going for. Next up is Ditto. And out of the 5 weeks that I had it on the team, I brought it 3 out of those 5 weeks. The main reason Ditto is somewhat low is mostly just because Ditto is Ditto, kind of like the Dubwool. It's, what it does is generally pretty straightforward from week to week. Regardless, I did run it with a different item every single week that I did bring it. 1 week I brought it with Choice Scarf, the another week I brought it with Electric Seed, and 1 week I actually brought it with Assault Vest, which was ultimately a really interesting pick that I think it was against the Lucian, and I had like an Assault Vest Tangela on the field, which was really cool, being able to survive like ice beams and whatnot pretty effectively and be somewhat disruptive with like knockoff. I think he had brought knockoff on his Tangela, so I was just sitting there spamming it because I think that was its only attacking move. But Ditto just really worked well for the team for a couple reasons. I already talked about sort of the pivot strategy several times now, and Ditto is a mon that really does benefit from switching in and out. Being able to learn opponents' move sets for one thing is really nice on the Ditto, but also having the ability to transform into different mons at different points throughout the game, and preserving the Ditto could be also quite useful. And another thing that I kind of wanted to consider on the Ditto was like room service potentially, if there was a situation where I was able to copy a sort of Trick Room mon that they were setting up on me, because my team did have a bit of a Trick Room weakness, despite the fact that I did have that Orbital. That was really my only sort of idea against Trick Room for a while. I could potentially swap in the Ditto, take advantage of that mon setting up, and I can also activate room service to underspeed it in Trick Room. I did not end up needing to have run that, but it was interesting as well. And another sort of crazy idea that you can do with Ditto that I wanted to really try at some point was running it with Limber instead of Imposter, and being able to transform into one of my own mons by just clicking transform onto it. So like week 8 against Lucian, I was at one point I was running this incredibly bulky, annoying Walrein set, and one thing that I was thinking of doing was clicking transform into my own Walrein and just having 2 of them spamming like Sheer Cold. That would have been an interesting strategy. I don't know if it would have been good. It might have been better than what actually happened in the game, so I'm not sure, but it was definitely a consideration. And I think part of the reason Ditto is sort of lower on this list right here is because I think everything from here on actually was pretty decent, but also Ditto is just a bit of a straightforward mon. It kind of just does what it does. You don't have as much control over it as you do your other mons, because obviously it's taking your opponent's prep and using it against them, and if your opponent doesn't bring a particularly effective set into itself, that's something that may end up biting you in the back. So yeah, so that was Ditto. Number 8 was Salazzle. Now Salazzle obviously was part of the package with Virizion that I had initially wanted. I also had Lipard on the team, who was a oftentimes better sort of fast fake out support option than the Salazzle. But regardless of that, what really helped Salazzle shine was its ability to take out, some more bulky threats, right? It can be a really threatening mon with its coverage, right? It has overheat, it has sludge bomb. Those are the sort of main things that I ran on it most of the time. If you'll see here, I brought it 4 out of the 8 weeks that I had it. I ran it with a Oblivious. I think all the weeks that I had it. I don't know why I have a 2 there. I think that's supposed to be a 4, but I also ran it with Fake Out 3 out of 4 of those weeks. And as you'll see, that's the week that I did not run Fake Out was me running choice specs on it, I believe. So overall, I think Salazzle had a pretty straightforward set of moves that were pretty consistent whenever it was good. I had ran it with a Helping Hand before. Those were generally the matchups where I expected to be under Trick Room potentially, or I felt like I needed some higher priority into maybe a faster Fake Out. I think obviously it gets Dragon Pulse, which was pretty decent coverage into Dragon Mons that I did not have super reliable coverage into, mostly because Tapu Koko just only gets Dazzling Gleam, right, as fairy coverage. So, if I ever needed like a single target, high damaging, super effective move into dragons, I was either left with Flygon running Draco Meteor or Dragon Claw or whatever, which is not always the exact damage that you want. Plus Salazzle is quite fast, so it's decent coverage. I never ended up running the Eject Pack set. It wasn't really super necessary in many of my matchups. There were a lot of support moves that Salazzle gets, like Fake Tears, Breaking Swipe, that I ended up not running. I think it gets Encore. Might get Disable as well, but at the end of the day, I had a Lipard on there, so Lipard also gets Fake Tears, also gets Encore, gets Charm, So ultimately, the Salazzle support sets were suboptimal compared to what Lipard could do. Corrosion sets could have been interesting. I didn't really run into any super tanky steel mons that would have been problematic. I never ran into a Registeel throughout my season, for example, which I definitely would have considered a corrosion set into with Toxic to just basically shut down whatever they were doing. And then another set that I was kind of thinking about was a physical Dragon Dance set a couple times, but again, Salazzle is quite frail, and if you're going to run a setup strategy on it, it also gets, I believe, Nasty Plot. If you're going to run a setup strategy on it, you got to be damn sure that it's safe to do that. With people running Earthquake into my Koko anyway, it wasn't super viable. So ultimately, Salazzle fulfilled a niche of a pretty decent, fast, special attacking mon with fire and poison coverage, which was needed for the team and did pretty okay, but it wasn't, maybe it would have been better if, maybe I had a different mon on the team that I could take advantage of for those things better. Moving on, this one is actually pretty surprising. Celesteela comes in at number 7, and as a tier 1 mon, it's, out of the 14 mons that I had, if it's number 7 is halfway down the list, it's not really what you want to get out of it. And I do think that obviously Celesteela is better in a max format overall, but at the same time, I did see some decent uses for it, and in the games that I did bring it, it was pretty decent. The main issue is that I didn't want it to just be decent, right? I wanted it to be sort of a hard carry. I kind of had it in this sort of anchor position that I wanted it. And most of the time it was just a little bit underwhelming. As you'll see, I ran it with quite a different variety of moves. Mostly I ran it as a special set. Out of 2 out of the 4 of those weeks, I had Air Slash Flash Cannon on it. But I also ran it with Steel Roller. Now this is a really interesting move that I think is really good synergy with the Tapu Koko, right? Obviously, you set that electric terrain, and Celesteela can now steel roller stuff with like an incredibly high base power physical steel move that's got 100% accuracy. And not only that, you're removing the anti-synergy that electric terrain gives your Celesteela. So, just like pretty solid synergy there that I really enjoyed. It also gets Giga Drain, Energy Ball. I ran it with Stomping Tantrum. I ran it with Electric Seed Acrobatics 1 week, which was pretty fun as a very strong stab coverage that you could get from it. You get it with Wide Guard potentially. You get it with Rock Slide. So, obviously a very decent mon. But ultimately, I think part of the issue again is its speed tier, much like the Swampert, much like the Poltegeist. It was in kind of an awkward speed tier where I kind of wanted to run it with like Tailwind potentially. And also kind of a little bit too fast for Trick Room. So, at the end of the day, it was a little bit tricky. Some considerations that I could have ran on it were Autotomize, which would have obviously increased its speed. That's something I thought of a couple weeks, but again, like if I'm running that, I might as well be running, Power or Meteor Beam, which is just going to be more effective damage if I'm going to have to sit there and set up for a turn. Obviously, depends on the matchup, depends on what's going on, but it was a potential just to make up for some of that speed issues that I was having with it. I didn't ever really run it with Earthquake. Again, I could have ran it with Earthquake with a lot of the mons that I had on my team. I had Flygon, who was immune to it. I had 2 Telepathy mons potentially in the form of Coco and Orbeetle. I could have done a lot with that. Leech Seed. I don't know why it says Leech Side here. I'm need to obviously proofread these slides a little bit better, but Leech Seed, sort of a stall set with Celesteela was something that I thought about a few weeks, but again, just if you're gonna do setup type stuff with Celesteela, you got to be in the right matchup, and it just didn't really come up that well. Also, didn't do Power Herb Meteor Beam very often. Mostly just ran Celesteela with some more defensive items like Assault Vest or Resist Berries or Electric Seed, right? Another coverage option that it gets is Smackdown, which is not a very widespread move. It's something that I looked at several times to see if there was any way I could take advantage of it, but ultimately didn't really find a use for it. But I just wanted to point it out. And then finally, Iron Ball did allow it to get into some pretty reasonable Trick Room speed tiers. And it does get Gyro Ball as well, which is obviously stab, but ultimately did not really find a decent enough use for that. Plus, if you're bringing Iron Ball on it, it's going to be weak to ground moves, which is something that they're going to be bringing against you if you have a Tapu Koko and a Salazzle. So, not super ideal. Moving on to number 6 was Flygon. And the funny thing about Flygon was I brought it 4 out of 8 weeks, and I actually brought it special every single week, which is really weird. I did bring it with 4 different items. I brought it with Assault Vest, Life Orb, Choice Scarf, and Expert Belt into different situations as needed. But I think one of the main things that made Flygon sort of stand out was that it actually got a lot of very similar coverage to Celesteela, right? It gets Giga Drain, it gets Air Slash, but unlike Celesteela, it gets special ground coverage in the form of Earth Power, which is more consistent than its main physical coverage of Earthquake, in the sense that Earthquake is getting reduced damage from being in spread, and you're hitting your own allies, despite the fact that, again, it did have a decent amount of mons who could ignore that ability or that spread coverage, right? So, yeah, I mean, it just was much more consistent in my opinion, and faster speed tier again, like 100 base speed was getting to the speed tier that I really needed it to be. It was much more consistent with like a choice scarf, much more consistent to run more physical, or sorry, not physical, but like more offensive items that could really take advantage of this coverage that it was getting, unlike the Celesteela. And part of me thinks that there was a point in the season, or even maybe during the grace period, where if I had realized this, I might have traded Celesteela for something that could have been a little bit more effective for the team, because Flygon was honestly covering that base pretty well, despite not having the best special attack stat. It was still doing pretty okay at that role, and I did have some decent special attackers on the team anyway. So, obviously, you could run it physical. It's probably better physical in a lot of teams, but in this team, it was just better as a special mon. So that's how I ran it. And obviously, Disquake could have been a thing. I could have ran it with Telepathy Coco, and spammed Disquake. And obviously, both of these mons would be immune to their partner's spread move there. Yeah, that's Flygon. So let's move on to number 5. Number 5 was Barraskewda. I had it for 3 weeks, and I brought it all 3 weeks. And I brought it pretty consistently as a mon that just was there to do a lot of damage. Life Orb 2 weeks, Choice Band 1 week. I brought it with Propeller Tail twice against specifically, I believe, what was it? I think Tangela against Lucian, and I think there was another Rage Powder Mon. I think it was Amoonguss against KJ, week 7. And then I brought it with Swift Swim with Rain Dance Lipard against Gumi, which was really funny because he also brought a Rain Dance set against me with his Kingdra. So it ended up being a bit of a Rain Dance duel, which was pretty cool. The main move sets that I ran on it was like Drill Run and Aqua Jet. During this time, I was running Trick Room a little bit more because I had picked up Gourgeist alongside the Barraskewda. So I was running Aqua Jet because obviously I wanted to have that priority under Trick Room, which was a strategy that I'd been employing a little bit more often. But otherwise, just got coverage moves, right? Poison Jab, Ice Fang, Drill Run, Close Combat. All of these things are incredibly strong. And why I enjoyed the Barraskewda so much was, again, it was able to function under, as sort of an incredibly fast mon straight out the gate with really threatening coverage options, really high base attack stat as well. And if I set Rain with Lipard, it's getting even more damage boosting abilities. It has pivot potential with Flip Turn, and it has potential to function under Trick Room with like Choice Banded Aqua Jets, also potentially under Rain. So the amount of consistency that it brought to the team, and the amount of immediate board presence that it had compared to the Swampert, in my opinion, meant that it was much more useful for the team, and I'm really happy to have made that trade partway through the season. Next up is surprisingly Walrein, who ended up being one of my most brought mons, which is interesting for a tier 5 mon, especially one that is weak to electric and being therefore anti-synergy with the Tapu Koko in some ways. Regardless, I brought it 5 out of the 8 weeks. I brought it with a Wakanberry 1 week, specifically against, I believe, Otto. But otherwise, the Assault Vest and the Weakness Policy ended up being incredibly useful items, both of which are sort of taking advantage of the fact that special offensive pressure against it was generally there. But with a Weakness Policy boost, it actually does quite a bit of damage. And another thing was, obviously people are going to be wanting to run, fire coverage, especially against Gorgeist and Celesteela, ice coverage against Gorgeist as well. Once I picked it up, and the thick fat ability on the Walrein was incredibly helpful as a switch in for a lot of that. I brought it mostly special, even though its special move set is quite limited. But Hydro Pump, Ice Beam was usually exactly what the doctor ordered in most matchups. I also ran it with Sheer Cold twice, which is a move that quite universally decent on a physical, like a really bulky mon who could just kind of last several turns. Where if you really needed to, you kind of spam it, especially in an end game situation where I already talked about like the rest sleep talk set. I could have ran Sheer Cold that week. I did not, but it could have been. Hindsight would have been very effective. Sort of stally set that Lucian brought against me. I also brought Fisher, which might seem weird until you realize that that's what I brought against Batista's mono ice team. So Sheer Cold is usually the better move, but if they have a full team of ice mons that are all immune to Sheer Cold, obviously Fisher is the better option there, even if they do have potential flying mons on that team, or mons that might be immune to Fisher. Otherwise, I had a bit of a physical set once or twice. I ran it with Liquidation, Icicle Spear, Heavy Slam at one point. There were some considerations, like running it physical with Oblivious into like Intimidate style teams. Definitely a consideration I had. I considered running it with Belly Drum at one point, but again, I did not have any redirections, so that was a lot inconsistent and maybe risky. Steel Roller was also a move that it gets synergized with the sort of Tapu Koko in the same way that Celesteela did, and it also gets Yan as a support option. So overall, it was just a mon that played that anchor role better than anything on the team. Right? It was just tanky enough to deal, take stuff pretty effectively. It was doing enough damage most of the time to hit KO quite a bit of stuff, especially if you ran it with weakness policy. It could start one-shotting some stuff with like Hydro Pump potentially, or if you wanted to run it super bulky, you could run it with those Oko moves. So overall, just like I'm not 100% sure why it worked so well, but it really did work well for the team, and I think it mostly has to do with the fact that thick fat ability allowed it to be a really nice switch in for a lot of mons, and it was just bulky enough to really take advantage of those switches much better than some of the mons who had 4 times weaknesses, as I sort of later realized as the season went forward. Moving on to number 3 was our boy Gorgeist, who I brought 3 out of 3 weeks that I had it, and it was just insanely impactful every single week that I had it. Maybe a little bit less so in against Lucian, because I did bring a bit of a more unconventional set. But that was mostly, it was mostly serving as sort of a trick room setter in that matchup, and it did its job, right? So, but against Gumi, I ran it choice banded. I was against a Tapu Bulu, and so I ran it choice banded with like Grassy Glide, and Shadow Sneak, so some priority moves that really did a lot of work into that matchup. Against KJ, I brought it with Iron Ball and Gyro Ball, with Trick Room, which was doing a lot into his sort of Trick Room mode. The Iron Ball being able to underspeed, the Diggersby. So just overall, like a really solid mon in a lot of cases. I ran it with Disable into Lucian's team, which ended up being pretty useful in some cases. Some other considerations that I had for it was, as a nasty plot setup mon, it's actually pretty decent. It gets access to Moonblast, which is fairy coverage that was much needed for this team, considering that Tapu Koko again, like I mentioned, only gets that dazzling gleam. But it also gets like fire coverage, it's like flamethrower and stuff. So like pretty decent special mon, even though it doesn't have a very decent special attacking stat. But if you can get off a nasty plot or two, like you can very much make this a good special attacking mon, especially if you're running it like the faster variants, and take advantage of that speed. You don't have to like set trick room for it with anything else. Another option that I considered was pickup, and I couldn't figure out a situation where I could get it to exactly work the way I wanted it to. But again, remember I did have that electric seed, and if there was ever a situation where I could activate an item on Gourgeist and bring out a mon in electric terrain to activate electric seed, Gourgeist would also be able to benefit from that electric seed with the pickup ability, which would have been really cool. And obviously Gourgeist has its signature move, Trick or Treat, which gives an ally or whatever your target is, it gives them the ghost type on top of their initial types. I thought that could have been a really nice synergy with the double, actually. If you give double the ghost type, make it immune to the physical moves, that usually does, and making its only weakness dark type, I think you'd have it, ghost normal type, which is the new Zoroark from the Hisui region. So that was something I was kind of looking out to potentially do, but again, just didn't really find the opportunity for that bit of a gimmicky strategy. Overall, Gourgeist sort of served its purpose as like a very threatening physical grass type that also took on that ghost role that I had lost with Poltegeist being traded away earlier in the season. And it played those roles very effectively. It was very flexible mon. It had a lot of utility, it had a lot of potential to do a lot of damage. So overall, like 10 out of 10 mon, just in general and for the team. Coming in at number 2, unsurprisingly, is Liepard. I brought this mon 6 out of 8 weeks, which was a lot. And I brought it mostly the same throughout those weeks. I brought it with Focus Sash and Prankster 5 out of 6 of those weeks. The other week being against specifically Batista, I brought it Electric Seed Unburden. 6 out of 6 of those weeks that I brought it with Fake Out. I brought it with Encore 5 out of those weeks. And Sucker Punch was also the primary move that I brought as its physical coverage. Charm was coming in after Sucker Punch as bringing it for 2 weeks. But the rest of the moves here were really just sort of like utility options that I sort of brought based on the matchup. There was, obviously I ran it, you see at the bottom of the list there, I ran it with Sunny Day and Rain Dance. Sunny Day, I think, was against a Panda's team, which had not only a strong sand mode, but also a Primarina, who I could nerf a little bit with the Sunny Day. And then against Gumi, like I mentioned, I brought Rain Dance to supplement the Barraskewda, and give it a Swift Swim synergy. I also brought it, I think, special 1 week with the Dark Pulse, which was, I don't think did anything, if I'm not mistaken, but it does have like equally high special attack to physical. So, there were certain situations where bringing Sucker Punch versus Dark Pulse would have been useful. Bringing it with like Thunder Wave and Fake Tears. Fake Tears is obviously very nice with this team, with the Tapu Koko, with the Celesteela. So, just solid stuff. And then against Batista, I ran Baton Pass with the Electric Seed, which actually ended up being incredibly relevant during the game, allowing my Tapu Koko to survive an Earthquake from Darmanitan with that +1 defense boost. So overall, just like incredibly consistent utility for the team, right? Being able to bring it either, Prankster or Unburden, able to get Fake Out synergy with that, able to run Encore, which I think was an incredibly useful move specifically against opponents' teams. When you're running sort of an aggressive strategy that relies on a lot of pivots, your opponent's going to want to protect a lot of times to disrupt that flow that you're creating. And so clicking Encore into Protect allows you to really disrupt their whole synergy. If they're running Fake Out as well, that's another more reason to run Encore, especially if they're running like a faster fake out somehow, or if they're switching in a fake out after you've already faked out with the Lipard. Or if you just have a turn one where you're trading fake outs, right? You fake out their Mon, they fake out Lipard's neighbor, you can just Encore their fake out the next turn. So Encore ended up being like pretty crucial for disrupting a lot of the sort of annoying stuff the opponent was trying to do against this sort of a strategy. Ended up being really nice. So unsurprisingly, let's move on to number one. This is Tapu Koko. Brought 7 out of 8 weeks. This mon is just kind of incredible. It's incredibly fast, has electric terrain. I ran it mostly special 5 out of 8 of those weeks, or 5 out of 7 of the weeks that I did bring it. But I also brought it physical some of the weeks with Wild Charge, Brave Bird. As you'll see, I had Life Orb a lot of times, which you could afford to do because of the fact that it's so fast. You're able to really leverage that physical offense or that special offense against the opponent and really chip them down. I ran it with Chukabaro 1 week as sort of a defensive option, but you see stuff like Choice Scarf on it. Those are for weeks where you have Mons that can double their speed somehow, usually taking advantage of weather or unburden or something. And running Tapu Koko with Choice Scarf, he has such wonderfully natural speed that you're able to run Choice Scarf and outspeed those Mons who can double their speed and take advantage of that pretty well. I did run it Telepathy 1 week apparently. I don't remember exactly when I ran it Telepathy. I think I ran it Telepathy against Otto because I expected him to bring a lot of spread moves, and I ran it alongside Ditto, so I was potentially running like Ditto with Earthquake and stuff to take advantage of that. And I also didn't want to power up his Thunderous, I think, so I didn't want to run Electric Surge and give opportunities for him to spam like Rising Voltage against me. I don't remember if Thunderous even gets Rising Voltage at this point, but I had some reasons for running it Telepathy into that matchup. As you can see, this is a really wide move set. You can run it with screens, and I basically ran it, pretty much every set that I wanted to run Tapu Koko with, or every set that I could imagine Koko running. I think the one that I didn't run that maybe I could have at some point was like a Calm Mind set, or maybe I could have run a more bulky set with like Iron Defense and Nature's Madness. But at the end of the day, I think like you can just look at the move sets here. You can look at how often I brought it. You can look at the diversity in play styles, and you can see that this Mon not only sort of served as the sort of heart of the team, but also was just incredibly flexible and useful in basically every matchup that I needed it in. That's my final Mon on the team. That's I've been talking for a while now, but hopefully you enjoyed listening to me ramble about some of these Mons. I think the overall takeaways from this were just more specific, advanced things that I could have tweaked to do better. But ultimately, I was really proud of the team that I made, really proud of how I played, and felt like I ended the season on a high note, and felt really good about the whole ordeal. So I'm looking forward to playing again in VDL. Might try out for S next time, just because A, it's a new game that's coming out, and I didn't do so well, this season and the last, so perhaps I want to, go and reevaluate where my true skill level is. But at the end of the day, I'm excited to jump back into it once Scarlet and Violet come out, and I wish the finalists all the best and hope they succeed. I'm very excited to watch Panda v Goomer. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful day or evening, whatever's going on over there. Peace out.